When it comes to classic book series out there are a few that I've read as many times as the Stone Moon Trilogy by M.C.A. Hogarth. If you've never even heard of this series before, I can't really blame you. According to Goodreads right now, there's a total of 198 ratings for the entire series, so to say it's obscure would be a pretty fair assessment. This is not the first series I've read from this author, and it's also not my #1 favorite. Both of those awards would go to the Dreamhealers series, but the Stone Moon Trilogy comes in at a close second, and it still holds a special place in my heart to this day. As the name would imply, the Stone Moon Trilogy is a 3-part fantasy series that takes place in the fictional world of the Jaka. Jaka, despite showing some similarities to humans in their behaviors, are well established in this series as a unique alien species. They have their own culture and traditions, and are especially defined by their biological differences. Jaka can be born as one of 3 sexes: male, called Emoto in Jaka language, female or Anadi, and neuter or Eperu. The different roles of these sexes are a central part of how Jaka society functions. Emoto and Anadi are the breeders that keep the species alive, while the Eperu have sturdy bodies and can do most of the hard work that's required of them. The Jaka know and respect that all 3 sexes are required to keep their species alive, to the point where both major religions, the Trinity and the Trifold, revolve around the unity and power of these 3 together. Each sex is also represented by their own god: the void for the males, the brightness for the females, and the world for the neuters. And I gotta say, Jaka terminology is just so good at working its way into your brain that it sounds wrong to not say Emoto, Anadi, and Eperu. Learning these terms not only feels natural as you go, but it really draws you into the world, like any good fantasy story should. Ever since my first time reading this series, I've actually never forgotten these terms, and that's another way the Jaka world establishes itself as something unique and memorable. Jaka are, in some ways, familiar and understandable, but at the same time, something exciting and new. There are the little things, like how each sex uses a different gesture for greeting or respect, or the larger biological aspects, like how a Jaka's wounds heal quickly, or how they produce tears from their fangs. When reading this series, it always feels like you are a part of their world, and this is helped by the fact that each story is told from the first-person perspective. In each book, we get to experience the inner thoughts and struggles of a different Jaka. And yes, I did say different. Each of these 3 books actually follows a different narrator. This might make the series sound rather disconnected, but the story of the Jaka, just like their 3 sexes, revolves around these parts coming together to form something important as a whole. So what is the story about, you might be wondering? I won't spoil too much, of course, but if I could summarize the tale of the Jaka into just one word, it would be change. When a species is slowly but surely dying out, what changes need to be made in order for them to survive? And more importantly, what are they willing to sacrifice to make these changes happen? On a more personal scale, each book is also about the connections between people, and the relationships and challenges that can form there. There are love stories and tragedies and betrayals, and they can make characters question their views of the world and if what they're doing is even right. And that actually leads into one of my favorite things about this trilogy: the way it tackles grey morality. The good guys, so to speak, do some really wonderful things in these stories, and they do some really messed up and awful things too. The bad guys do some pretty horrible things, but they have a reason why they do these. The Stone Moon Trilogy, and especially the later 2 books, will really make you question what's right and what's wrong in this world. Is there a limit to what you should do to save a species, or is no cost too great? By the end of the books, well, that's up to you to decide. Across this series, which by the way consists of Book 1, The Worth of a Shell, Book 2, Pearl in the Void, and Book 3, A Bloom in the North, you can imagine you'll meet a handful of different characters. These include Thennet, Dolane, Roika, Sepper, Ilushet, Keshul, Dekashin, Belil, Abadil, Edinil, Pathan, Hesa, Darcy, Cadwyn, and Loe, to name a handful of them. The names won't mean anything if you haven't read the series, but to me these are the most important and memorable characters in all 3 books. Understandably, the narrator of each book gets the most time in development, but I'm always pleased with the value given to the side characters as well. The writing of the Stone Moon Trilogy is pretty straightforward. Occasionally the prose can be a bit too flowery, but overall it's both easy to follow and engaging. Here's a little passage from Book 1, which highlights both the writing and struggles and change that the characters are going through. There's nothing to fear. Okay, Anadi, this isn't right, I whispered. What's right? What's wrong? Does it matter? Did it please you? Yes, no, I don't know. She hugged me then. I held my arms out. I couldn't figure out what to do with them. To hug her. Maybe the scent and feel of her alone would turn the rest of me into an Emoto. As I mentioned earlier in the video, because everything takes place from the first-person perspective, it makes things feel very personal, as if you were a Jaka growing up in their world with them. This makes it easier to sympathize with the characters, and is helped by the bits of humor and other touches in the writing. Here's an example from Book 3, with the names removed. I suppose I could just give it my money and let it invest it for me, I said. The character growled. You're horrible, character, just horrible. He wrinkled his nose. Also, you should do that. I chuckled. Maybe I will. I've always liked the dialogue in these books, and I still like it even after my 5th or 6th reading, because despite the horrible things they might do, somehow the characters remain sympathetic, even the ones you might not expect at first. There's one character in particular who I'm not going to name that I changed my mind completely about from the beginning to the end of the series. And this character is the reason that the last section of Book 3 gets me every time, and is still my favorite part of the entire series. To bring themselves back from ruin, the Jaka need a savior, and it's still a shocking thing to see in the end, when the tragic hero who gives up everything in an effort to save their people isn't the hero you were expecting at all. One of the main problems I still have with this storytelling is that because it uses first-person perspective, certain important events with other characters take place off-screen, and we only get to hear about them through the narrator and the characters that they meet. It's not a deal-breaker for me by any means, but it is one of the major flaws in the books that I would point out. In my opinion, Book 1 is the weakest of the trilogy, and is more of a starting point for the things to come, as well as an adventure into some of the different parts of the Jaka world. The story picks up more in Book 2, Pearl in the Void, and then Book 3, A Bloom in the North, is definitely my favorite. The last section, which is about 90 pages, still just impresses me every single time I read it, even when I know what's going to happen. After I finished my initial recording of this, I actually figured out why Book 1 doesn't have as much story in it as the other two. The last two books were written several years after the first, and it seems that Worth of a Shell was originally intended to be a standalone book. It was only later that the author decided to continue it into a full series. When it comes to fantasy stories, the Stone Moon Trilogy is really a classic for me, even if I don't agree with everything it has to say. In fact, I think the way it makes you question Jaka society, and the things that they do to change it, is a lot more interesting than just playing it safe. There are some scenes of pretty explicit rape and violence and torture in this series, but they highlight the purpose of unity and compassion in the Jaka world. Emoto, Anadi, and Aperu, they need each other, and I'm so glad this series takes that approach, over trying to point the blame and separating the sexes. So overall, while this series isn't perfect, and it's not very popular either, I'd still love the Stone Moon Trilogy, and all the things it's gotten me through in the past. To fans of fantasy stories and different species of creatures, and tales of societal change, give this story a chance, and who knows, maybe one day you'll consider it a classic too. For extra reading on the Jaka, there's also this collection of short stories called Clays Beneath the Skies. This is a good follow-up to the trilogy, and if you liked that, I would recommend this too.